Welcome back. This time we're talking about Timeless, Season 1, Episode 9, The Last Ride of Bonnie and Clyde, which is the final episode before the fall finale next week. This time our trio goes back to May 22nd, 1934 in Arkansas. And although they don't at first know why they're back in the Dust Bowl, they soon find themselves in a race with Flynn to get this key that has some connection to Rittenhouse. Unfortunately for them, the key is on a chain around Bonnie's neck. And Lucy and Wyatt are forced to join the famous outlaws as they escape from a botched bank robbery and get into a gunfight with a group of rangers who have been joined by Flynn. And though as usual the events don't quite play out like they did in the original timeline, the episode ends with Bonnie and Clyde dead and Flynn with the key, which he then uses to open some kind of odd clock device and seems quite surprised or even delighted at what he sees. Of course we don't, because it goes to credits with the notice that next week is the fall finale. As usual, this was another solid episode with a good time travel of the week, as well as some development in the Rittenhouse storylines, as well as finally giving some character development to Agent Christopher, handing her a storyline in present day as she continues her investigation into Connor Mason. But aside from the actual plot developments, I think the thing that I'll take away the most from this episode was some really good acting, both from the guest stars portraying Bonnie and Clyde, as well as Mark Lanter as Wyatt. So far this season, we've had two major takeaways with Wyatt's character. A, he's a soldier, and B, he lost his wife to a murder and really wants to use the time machine to get her back. And while his wife's death has been a defining character trait of Wyatt throughout this series, and I don't want to take away what Latner's done with the character up until now, but the moment when he uses his actual proposal story as cover when pretending to be a couple with Lucy, with Bonnie and Clyde, that was possibly one of the best moments of this entire series as far as acting goes. It was so heartfelt. We knew from the moment he started talking that he was actually talking about his proposal to his wife, but it still worked so well. It was some wonderfully written dialogue, and it was delivered even better as far as I'm concerned. Now, the somewhat ironic thing about that scene is the act of pretending to be a couple with Lucy and sharing a kiss seems to have affected both of them, as we see at the end of the episode, when they both pretend that the kiss meant nothing. Of course, with Lucy, she's still dealing with the fiancé that she doesn't know. And the episode opens after our gambit with Bonnie and Clyde getting killed in the original timeline, with Lucy trying to have a date with a fiancé that she doesn't know. As she points out later, it's her first date with him and probably his 400th with her. And it's a relationship that just doesn't seem destined to work, but does tie in with the core emotional storyline of this episode, talking about true love, soulmates, for the lack of a better word. I don't think they actually ever used that term, but the idea that we have one person in this world that's destined to us. In the case of Wyatt, he's lost his wife, and in the case of Lucy, she may have found someone, but she doesn't remember finding him. And while we're talking about romance, Rufus and Jaya's romance seems to be continuing on as they share a nice kiss. And Rufus gets some inevitable ribbing from his friends when they find out that he's actually finally sealed a deal with this relationship. Now, before we get back to the key and the primary Rittenhouse storyline of this week, let's talk about Agent Christopher. Now, she's a character that really has been given no development before this week. And frankly, I hadn't even remembered what her name was until I looked it up for last week's video, when I talked about how she had ordered one of her agents to begin a surveillance on Connor Mason, something I predicted would not end well for her. Now, the inevitable blowback from that decision still hasn't been felt, but we did get to see Connor Mason meeting with his Rittenhouse agent and tells him that Agent Christopher has found some evidence about Rittenhouse in Flynn's warehouse. The same evidence she used to send the trio after the key. It's obvious that Agent Christopher doesn't trust Connor at this point, especially since she actually says in this episode she doesn't trust him. I did find it more than a little ominous that we learn that she has a kid at the beginning of this episode, especially with Rittenhouse's tendency to threaten families. Ultimately, she doesn't confront Connor, but instead Rufus, asking him what he knows about Rittenhouse and Connor Mason's involvement, which prompts Rufus to give her a very stern warning about staying away, which of course she ignores, and he agrees to tell her about Rittenhouse and Connor Mason. Just how much he's going to tell her and how the others are going to react when they find out, if he tells them, is going to be interesting to see next week. So of course, as I've said already, the biggest development long-term plot-wise in this episode was this Rittenhouse key. Somehow Flynn found out about it, and that is why he went back to 1934 to steal this key from Bonnie. And it turns out Bonnie was given the key by Clyde, and he had stolen it from Henry Ford, who then offered $50,000 in 1934 money to get it back, strongly implying that Henry Ford has some involvement with Rittenhouse. So far, the show has refrained from implicating any major historical figures as being involved with Rittenhouse. We saw that President Nixon knew of Rittenhouse, but he was actually trying to get information on them, and he seemed somewhat afraid of them. Lucy is able to translate a Latin phrase on the key, which says, "The key to the beginning of all time, the key to the end of all time," which, as she points out, is somewhat ominous. In the ensuing shootout between Bonnie and Clyde and the Rangers, Flynn is able to steal the key and get away. And as I mentioned, he goes somewhere and is able to use the key in this clock-looking device, and it opens up and reveals this scroll with a wax seal. I really couldn't see too well what the seal was. I'm assuming it had something to do with Rittenhouse or a specific person, but I really couldn't get a good enough look even after pausing it. But there's writing on the scroll. We do get to see that, but we don't really get to read any of it. But Flynn does, and you can see the look on his face. It's definitely something important. And since next week is the fall finale, I'm going to assume, or at least hope, that we're going to find out more about what was in that letter next week. So really, aside from the potential involvement of Henry Ford in Rittenhouse, we really didn't get any concrete new evidence on Rittenhouse, what they are, what they're doing. But we did get some genuine plot development with Agent Christopher continuing her investigation of Connor, as well as her getting Rufus to agree to tell her about what he knows. And of course, this letter is definitely going to have some kind of involvement in future storylines. We just don't know enough about it yet to know what that's going to be. But I have to say, with one episode left for the fall half of this first season, I'm still really enjoying this show. It's got good production values, it's got good acting, good storylines. There really hasn't been in any episodes where I just go, wow, that just didn't work for me. Which for a freshman show says a lot. But what did you think of this episode? Did you enjoy it? What do you think of these new plot developments? The key, the letter, Agent Christopher's investigation of Connor. As always, you can subscribe to my channel. Check out some other TV and movie reviews. And until next time, take heed of any ominous feelings you might have.